This week on Mustang Monday, nothing. Nothing at all got done. But this week, I got the brakes started, the hoses are run to the calipers on both of the front brakes, ready for me to fabricate the hard lines too. I was working on the hard lines when I realized I needed to put the brackets on so that I could terminate the hard lines appropriately. I went digging through my box of junk and found the old brackets, and I also found the new brackets, so I opted to put the shiny new brackets on instead. I dug the steering box out of the attic and attached it, put it in place, and tentatively hooked everything up so that I can at least control the front wheels as a unit now instead of having to fight with them independently. This is a sort of jury-rigged power steering center link at the moment. I intend to buy a manual steering center link eventually, but for right now it'll work and make it easier to move things around. I got the hard lines started all the way around. The proportioning valve bracket is fabricated and mounted into the car, and the line to go from the rear proportioning valve, or distribution valve actually, to the proportioning valve is already installed. I had to fabricate that. I bought 25 feet of nickel copper brake line, a bender, and a flaring tool, and I'm going to fabricate the entirety of the brake system. I can say with 100% certainty, it took me longer to figure out how I wanted to mount this than it actually did to mount it. Once I figured out which way I needed the input and outputs to go and where I wanted the bracket and stuff like that, it really didn't take that long. The kit that I bought for the front brakes came with the proportioning valve for the rear wheels and this little metal bracket that I proceeded to chop up and cut up because I didn't really want to mount it where the kit originally wanted it mounted. But in order to put it where I wanted it, I needed to bend it up and cut it up so that there was going to be room to actually access the control valve, because it doesn't do me any good if I can't turn the valve to set the brakes. So I cut it up and bent it up, or bent it up and cut it up, and got everything squared away, and then did a test fit. When I was confident that that was where it was needed to be, I spray painted it, and then ended up having to go back and redo it again anyways. I got it all painted up and gave it a test fit, and while I was messing with it, it dawned on me that I could probably go ahead and take that power booster off. While I had the power booster off, I tightened up the brackets and got everything ready, because I'm hoping to do one last installation of this stuff. And from there, it was on to the lines. I used a coat hanger as a sort of guide to figure out what shape I needed the lines to be. Started making my bends, and then what I would do is I'd just kind of compare it to everything in the bender and make sure that things were going to line up the way that I wanted. They were at the appropriate angle. This tubing is great. It's really, really easy to work and really easy to bend. So even with this cheap Harbor Freight bender, things went pretty smoothly. Mostly. Sorta. Now, this cheap little Harbor Freight double flaring tool got by. It's a little sloppy. Tends to want to flop off to one side, but again, the tubing being flexible enough, it made things fairly easy to get done. So I had the first line all nice and neat and bent up, and I was trying to put it together, and I couldn't figure out why this fitting would not screw into the distribution valve. And that's when I realized that I didn't put the right fitting on it. So I had to relocate the bracket, re-drill it a little bit, change things around, put the right fitting on there, and eventually I had that thing in place, and then I moved on to the passenger side front wheel. Laid things out with my coat hanger, then started transferring that to the tubing, and back and forth to the Mustang a couple of dozen times, and then I finally moved into the engine bay and just worked from there. Just patience and time. Measure, bend, measure, bend, measure, bend. Recommendation to anybody that decides that they want to do their own brake line work: when you buy your tools or your brake line, just buy a new tubing cutter. The small ones are cheap, and having a nice sharp one, way better than using the beat up dull one that I did. Here I'm bending the tubing around a impact socket, and it is soft and easy enough to bend without kinking around a large enough socket. Pretty handy stuff. I also got the driver's side rear quarter window installed. I
had to take the panel off underneath the seatbelt, and figured while I had that off, I would go ahead and spray paint that satin black, because that's what everything's going to be.
Made this comment before, but I really miss my Mini Blaster. I got ready to start putting the windows in and realized that these brackets hadn't actually been painted, prepped, ground, blasted, whatever. So I did. I wire wheeled them as best I could, threw a couple coats of primer on them, a couple coats of the aluminum enamel, and I put them in. Pulled the panel off so I could get to the window, and like I said, while it was set aside, I threw some paint on it. I put the bracket in and installed the bolts in loosely, since I'm going to be making a bunch of adjustments to this, and then coated the channels of the guide panel really, really, really well with some nasty red grease. Probably not the best choice for this, but it's what I had. And with the panel greased up and put in place, I started lowering the window, keeping the rollers in the guides. Once I had the windows down so that it would go all the way down and all the way back up, I clamped it in place and started messing with the regulator. This ended up proving to be one of those, man, I really need a third arm type of situation. But I finally got the regulator in, put the pivot arm back in place, fastened everything down, and gave it a couple of test runs. Had to make a few adjustments, and then when everything was adjusted and the window was working mostly, I tightened all the bolts down. The window sticks a little bit at one point in time in the roll-up, but I suspect that the regulator may be slightly bent and I didn't catch it when I was putting it up, but I'm not taking it out to put it back in right now.
The hardware kit and the gasket set for the motor came in late in the week. I'm hopefully going to be starting next week by putting the motor together. If all goes well, before the end of next week, hopefully I will be able to function test that motor. Looking forward to that. Have a great week.